Hi again then guys, and welcome to the third installment of Beards and Cars, the more informal series where we just chat nonsense about this, that and the other, games, cars, basically everything in between. Now, in this particular pick, I wanted to carry on a couple of thoughts from the previous episode, because of course we were talking best and worst car games, my favourite car games, but we didn't really cover all of the bases. It's such a big discussion that you can have, and I had some great comments from you guys as well. I didn't actually realise that a lot of you guys actually enjoy some of the more obscure stuff that I enjoy as well. Stuff like Road Trip Adventure, Enthusia, that kind of thing. Car games which aren't talked about as much, but are definitely still worth checking out if you do have the opportunity. Now, as far as those particular games, I wanted to get into those a little bit more. And there were 4 games in particular that I wanted to talk about more in this episode. And of course, you can check out the time markers down in the description to see the different topics that we're going to talk about in this particular video. But first of all, I wanted to talk about Road Trip Adventure, because of course I covered that in my recent entire collection of my games video. And I've actually bought some more games since making that video, so at some point I'll probably do an update of my game collection. I've bought a couple of good ones. They're mostly car games. Some of them I plan to play, others I don't really care about. I just bought them because they were cheap, and to pad out my collection, basically a little bit more. Now, as far as games like Road Trip Adventure, Enthusia, that kind of thing, I really like that those games put a huge amount of passion into what they do, even though you have to think to yourself that the developers 9 times out of 10 probably know that the games aren't going to do that well. Especially in the case of something like Enthusia, they certainly tried hard to make it a great game, and I think for the most part it is, especially for its time, but at the same time they had to know that going up against such a stalwart as Gran Turismo couldn't really do that well. Because yes, nowadays, with stuff like AC, Project Cars, Drive Club, they are edging into the market. But on the PS2, Gran Turismo basically had the entire market of realistic racing games dominated. You had some others, like Toka, but even then, those games just don't have the scope of Gran Turismo. Whereas these days with stuff like AC, Project Cars, etc., it's a much more open market, especially now that Forza's got even bigger. You've got Horizon as well, various other games which have come out to more or less success here and there. Whereas when Enthusia came out back in the day, around a decade ago or so, it didn't have really anywhere near as much of a chance as a game like that would have now. I believe that if Enthusia, in a modern form, but with the same essential idea, came out now on the PS4 and it hadn't come out before, and it was still called Enthusia and was the same game but had better graphics, etc., I think it could do much better now than it did then, because the market is much more accepting of other games apart from just the 2 titans of Forza and Gran Turismo. And that's great. It's great to see that other companies, other manufacturers, other brands can make their mark, maybe have their own little niche or their own spin, and that's great, because when 1 or 2 companies have a total dominance on the market, such as for instance the mobile phone market with Apple and Samsung, and then all the others are not quite as dominant, it means that those companies can basically do whatever they want, because they know that people are going to buy their product, and where else are you going to go? Some people might buy a lesser brand or a lesser known brand or shop around, but most people won't. Most people will just go with the crowd. Now, in the case of Gran Turismo and Forza, their dominance didn't really lead to anything bad. The games were still fantastic, and each and every game that they produced, respectively from, of course, Polyphony or Turn 10, they put their all into each game. Regardless of whether or not you're a fan of Forza, or vice versa, if you're not a fan of Gran Turismo as much, you do have to admit they put a huge amount of development and effort into their games. Now, with games like Enthusia, which if I remember correctly I think was a Konami game, I believe, unless I'm mistaken, but that game, if you've never played it, is a game which, at least if you enjoy PS2 gaming, I would recommend trying to pick up, because it's it's not super rare, but you don't really hear it talked about that much. You don't see people playing it that much. It's not a game which you really hear people asking for. Now, personally, I would actually really like to see Enthusia return. Not necessarily even in Enthusia 2, to be honest. Although calling it Enthusia 2 would, by definition, garner more attention for the original. And that would be great. Anything to get more people playing it and talking about it would be fantastic. But even if it was just called Enthusia again, and it was just a redux of that original idea, that would still be awesome. Now, if you haven't played Enthusia, and a lot of people still haven't, basically the game is kind of like Gran Turismo, with a little bit of TOCA kind of thrown in there. But overall, I think Enthusia did a really good job of having its own signature. It does not feel like Forza, it does not feel like Gran Turismo. From the box, and of course if you saw my game collection you'll have seen the back of the box, or you can just Google it, the graphics can definitely rival Gran Turismo, especially at the time on the PS2. There are very few games which can genuinely claim that. But Enthusia can. It can rival Gran Turismo, and some of the cars look better than Gran Turismo. In fact, some of the graphics on that game, I would say, look better than the non-premium cars that we have on GT6 even. Stuff like the Jaguar XFR, which still looks awful, despite the fact that it's a newer model. Now, on Enthusia, there is, from what I can remember at least, because it's been a while since I played it, and I never got into it a huge amount, because when I did first play it, I was about, I think, 13 or so, and I already loved Gran Turismo, and I didn't really need Enthusia in my life. Gran Turismo was more than enough for me, but with Enthusia, the game feels much more strictly structured than Gran Turismo does, especially at the time, because its main rival was GT4, and GT4 is the epitome of doing whatever you want. You can progress through that career in basically whatever order you want. You could do rally events first, you could do endurance as soon as possible, you could get cheap second-hand cars or buy new ones, you could do missions, you could do licenses to win cars instead of buying them, etc. There were so many possible routes that you could take to accomplish your GT4 adventure, and that's one of the reasons why it's such a great game, because you could play through the game an infinite amount of times and take a different path every single time. Whereas with other games like GT6, as an example, the career mode is very linear. You cannot progress onto the next one unless you've done that one. I don't like that as much. GT5 was a little bit less in that regard, because you could kind of swap and change between A-Spec and B-Spec, and I do miss that separation. Having B-Spec as an entire career mode was very cool. I actually like directing races, and I do miss that. We have it, of course, on GT6, but it's not that great. At least in my opinion, of course. Now, with Enthusia, you also had cars which Gran Turismo still has never had. And to my knowledge, Forza has only had a couple of them, and only on a couple of occasions even, as, say, DLC. Vehicles like, if I remember correctly, the Saab 9.5 was on there. Now, of course, that's not a car that everyone's clamouring for, but the fact that they have unique models is a great selling point. And not only is it a good selling point, but it's a good reason to go back. Because, I don't know about you guys, but I find that older car games which feature certain vehicles which they've never had since, I'm looking at you, Gran Turismo 2, are great reasons to go back and play them again. Now, for me, it's not just Gran Turismo that does that. Project Gotham does it as well. I've talked before about how the MTT Y2K, my favourite motorbike, is only featured on Project Gotham 4. It's not featured on any other racing game that I'm aware of. Likewise with the older Forza games. If you've been playing Forza for a while, maybe as far back as Forza 2, which is where my Forza experience started, you may remember that there were cars on that game that have never been featured since. We still have stuff like the Hennessy Venom GT, but there was a Hennessy Viper on that game as well, the 800 twin turbo, and probably my favourite car not to be featured on Forza anymore. No, it's not the Chrysler ME412. I know a lot of people miss that car, and I certainly do as well. But the car that I missed the most wasn't amazing, it wasn't fantastic, but it looked totally unique. It was an amazing concept race car that never really went anywhere, it's not talked about, and it's from a manufacturer which you would never expect to make a car as cool as it. And the car is called the Seat Cupra GT. If you've played Forza 2, you'll probably remember the car. You may or may not have loved it. It's not an overly fast vehicle, and if you Google it, I personally think it's an amazing looking car. It looks kind of like the Seat equivalent of a combination between a Mosler MT900 and a TVR Speed 12. It's got that big aerodynamic bulbous look of the TVR, but at the same time with the mid-mounted engine style, the rear wing, the racing-inspired visuals of the Mosler. It's got around 500 or so horsepower in the game, I believe it was. Handling is basically GT3 level. In fact, all of its performance is basically GT car level. I'd love to see cars like that brought back. But as is, it's a great reason to go back and play that game again. Likewise with Enthusia, you've got cars which still aren't on other games. Now, as I said, people don't love Saab. Of course, Saab has fans. I'm one of them. I do like Saabs. I like the fact that they're different and quirky, and Forza has had Saabs as well, such as the 9.9 Turbo, which is an awesome classic. But Enthusia had that years before, and it looks great. As I said, the graphics are phenomenal. They hold up really well even now. Then you had other cars like the Smart for 2 was also on there. And again, it's not a car that people are clamouring for, although Forza has had that car as well on Forza 4. But again, it's just nice to have that kind of variation involved in a game which doesn't necessarily need to have that variation. They could have quite easily brought out a game that had the cars which were expected. Now, if you bring out a racing game, there are certain vehicles which, if you have them, any car guy is going to buy the game. If you've got Koenigsegg's on your game, people are going to want it. If you've got Paganis, Ferraris, Lambos, Maseratis, TVRs, Astons, Jags, Bugattis, McLarens, that kind of stuff, you're pretty much guaranteed to have an audience. Saab, on the other hand, that's not a requirement. Now for me, and I'm sure for some of you guys as well, if I look on the back of a racing game and I see a Saab or a smart car, that immediately piques my interest. In fact, that piques my interest more than if I saw a Koenigsegg on the back, because at the end of the day, of course there's going to be a Koenigsegg on the back. That's what everyone's trying to accomplish now. And of course I'm using Koenigsegg as a metaphor. But in this particular occasion, when you see something like a Saab or a smart car or a Citroen DS, which is also on Enthusia, that actually impresses me more, because I think, well, wait a second, they're not just trying to make a quick buck. They've had an idea, probably for years, that they wanted to make this game. Whether or not they wanted to make it a competitor to Gran Turismo is kind of irrelevant, but they've wanted to make this game. There's clearly a lot of passion behind it, and not only have they gone to the trouble of having all the obvious great cars that you would want, stuff like LMPs, DTM cars, rally cars, all that obvious stuff, but they've gone out of their way to get the licensing and to detail and to map into the game cars which 90% of players won't care about, but they've done it for the 10% of us that do. And that kind of passion behind a game really impresses me. And that's one of the reasons why I would say check out Enthusia, if for no other reason than to appreciate what its creators were trying to do. Because it is a work of art, I would say. Enthusia for its time is a remarkable game. And although I never loved that game as much as others, I do recognise just how good it was, especially for its time. Now, Road Trip Adventure, of course, I mentioned earlier on in this video, and this was another game that was mentioned in the previous episode's comments, and I was surprised to see the love there for it. I thought I was one of the only people who played Road Trip Adventure, and of course not. They sold thousands of copies or whatever, but it's not a game that you hear people talk about. It's a game which is very easy to underestimate, but it's fantastic, but not as a racing game. It is a driving game, but it's actually, as the name suggests, an adventure game. I would say that Road Trip Adventure is a fantastic adventure game that happens to involve cars. It's not a car game in a traditional sense. It's not about having realism. It's not about racing. There are races in it, but it's not about that. It's about, to some degree, problem solving. It's about collecting. It's about exploring, discovering, having fun, and it has, and I mentioned this again in my collection video, but it has an innocence about it. And although the word innocence tends to be associated with stuff like being childish, I have a very dark interest in life, in most things. I love horror films, I love dark things, I love gore, and I love Road Trip Adventure. So the fact that it can be loved by someone like me who loves dark, evil stuff, can attest to the fact that no, it's not a kid's game. It's just a really good quality game. And I know from those comments, and others as well, that you guys appreciate that game as much as I do as well. Now, Road Trip Adventure is totally different to something like Enthusia. It's a game which some people will absolutely adore, like I do, and some of you guys do. Other people probably will play it once or twice and never go back to it. Not because it's a bad game, but because they were just maybe expecting something that it wasn't, or would just prefer to play something more in the way of Gran Turismo, or Tokka, or Forza, that kind of thing. And that's fine. It's not a traditional game at all. It's very much so a Japanese game, and I mean that in a good way. Japan has a tradition almost of making stuff that's a bit out there. And in the case of Road Trip Adventure, I think it really paid off. It has that magic spark that some games have. Now, another thing that I wanted to continue the conversation on was actually an aspect of my favourite games from last week, because I talked Gran Turismo, of course, but I wanted to talk Forza as well, because I know that most of you guys on the channel prefer Gran Turismo. Many of you have never even played Forza and have no interest in playing Forza. I can understand that. It's fanboy logic. And although I don't hate fanboys, I do think that radical fanboys are very much so flawed in their thinking. And I don't mean that in a way that the stuff that they say offends me. The way I see it, people who are closed-minded to other games or other consoles really are just not that intelligent, because you're closing yourself off to the opportunity of not finding something better. We're not saying that Forza's better than Gran Turismo, and anybody who does is quite simply a moron, because there is no better. Better is a term which you have to quantify. What do you mean by better? Does it have more cars, more sales, better graphics? Who cares? Road Trip Adventure doesn't have the best graphics, but it's a fantastic car game. So, no, Forza is not better than Gran Turismo, and Gran Turismo is not better than Forza, although many people would say that it is. Now, my experience with playing the two has been skewed more towards Gran Turismo, but I still wouldn't say that it's better. And the reason why my experience has been more with Gran Turismo is quite simply because it came out first. That's no reason that the game is better, it's just a historical fact. Maybe the guy who wanted to make Forza didn't have the opportunities that Kaz did. That's not his fault, that's just where he was in life. I'm not saying that is the case, but if it were. Now, my racing history, if you will, of gaming, went from Gran Turismo 2, and of course I played other games as well, but I'm just talking Gran Turismo and Forza. I played Gran Turismo 2 first, then GT3, then GT4, then I didn't get a PS3, because at the time I couldn't afford to, I just didn't have that much interest in GT5, it didn't look that great to me, and I kind of still believe that, to be honest. But then I went to Forza 2. I bought an Xbox 360, I ultimately ended up having 4 of them because the reliability isn't that great, and I'm the first one to admit it. Then I played Forza 3, which I didn't really like that much either, in a similar way to Gran Turismo 3. Then I played Forza 4, which is fantastic, the best one of the series as far as I'm concerned. Then I came back to Gran Turismo, and I'm not including the Horizon games either, although I did play Horizon 1. Then I got GT6, then I got GT5, then I bought some of the prologues, etc., mainly for the collector's aspect, and then I moved back to, of course, the PS4 in anticipation, more than anything else, of GT Sport, and I also got the Xbox One to branch out into something which I've always wanted to do on the channel, which was provide content for Forza fans, such as myself. Now, I never expected those Forza videos to have the views that I get on some of the Gran Turismo videos, and they don't. Of course they don't. Because for one thing, I've been doing Gran Turismo content for 2,000 videos, so of course the Forza stuff isn't going to have the same kind of following. But that's the point. I'm branching out. I want to be one of the relatively few channels who caters for 2 of the biggest racing communities there are, and using the same skills of being a real mechanic applied to a racing game to benefit both audiences and bring the communities together to break down those absolutely retarded barriers between the two, to realise, hey, this game is not a challenge to my way of life and an insult to my ancestors, it's just an alternative. Now, Gran Turismo and Forza are both fantastic. I love them both. Gran Turismo had an earlier place in my life, but Forza I have probably just as much love for, and the only reason why I would give Gran Turismo as a franchise the edge for me is quite simply because I started playing it at a younger age, and so it has more nostalgia for me. Forza, though, I love as well. I just got to it later, so it doesn't have that kind of connection that Gran Turismo just naturally has. And of course, as I was saying about progressing through the games, I then went from Gran Turismo 6 to getting the Xbox One, etc., then got Forza Horizon 2, I think it was first, and Forza 6. Then I bought Forza 5, mainly for the collection aspect, and then of course Horizon 3, which we're doing videos for at the moment. But that's it overall for this particular instalment of Beards and Cars, and we'll probably touch on the subject again. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.